The Montana blizzard was not merely falling. It was a malevolent, shrieking entity. A white demon with an insatiable appetite, clawing at the world, intent on devouring every landmark, every soul foolish enough to be caught in its icy maw. Garrett Cole, a man who had long convinced himself his heart was as irrevocably frozen as the winter landscape fought the protesting groan of his pickup truck. The vehicle, usually a steadfast companion, felt like a toy in the storm's colossal grip. Each agonizing screech of the wipers across the ice-encrusted windshield was a fresh assault on his frayed nerves. He'd been battling the mountain pass for what felt like an eternity, the truck fishtailing precariously on a particularly sharp, invisible switchback only moments before. The chasm to his right had yawned a black promise of oblivion before the tires miraculously found purchase. Now stranded, his engine sputtering and dying, with a final resigned cough. The silence that followed was almost more terrifying than the wind's howl. The gas line, he suspected, had frozen solid. Visibility was a cruel, suffocating joke. A few feet of swirling white, then an impenetrable curtain. He leaned forward, and muscles rigid, his breath fogging the glass, despite the heater's dying, strained efforts. On the passenger seat, a small, crinkled brown paper bag held Sophie's asthma medication. His daughter. His anchor in a life that often felt adrift. She'd been wheezing badly when he tucked her in her tiny chest, a fragile bellows laboring for each breath. "Back soon, sweet pea," he'd whispered, kissing her feverish forehead, the memory a fresh stab of guilt. The pharmacy in town, a treacherous hour's drive in good weather, was now an impossible distance away. The soon was stretching into a treacherous, potentially lethal eternity. Out here, forecasts were polite fictions. The mountain made its own rules. He'd learned that the hard way. His knuckles were white stone against the useless steering wheel. He had to get moving on foot. But the nearest shelter, another old trapper's line cabin, was miles back and going forward. Sophie. He buried his face in his hands, the cold seeping through his gloves. Defeated. Again. Just like with Rachel. The thought, unbidden and sharp, sliced through him. Then through the maelstrom, a smear of flashing orange. Hazard lights. Barely discernible, ghostly. And a shape. No shapes. Another vehicle skewed precariously on the narrow shoulder, dangerously close to the same drop he'd just avoided. And beside it, a dark figure almost swallowed by the accumulating drifts, kneeling, clutching something small. Adrenaline cold and sharp, a jolt stronger than the wind's icy teeth surged through Garrett. Survival instinct and something deeper, a rescuer's ingrained response, overrode his despair. He threw open the door, the wind snatching his breath, and plunged into snow that swallowed him to his thighs, each step a brutal effort. "Hey!" he roared, his voice ripped away by the storm's fury. "You all right?" The figure didn't respond. As he stumbled closer, fighting the wind and the deepening drifts, the scene crystallized into a living nightmare. A woman, her thin coat agape face raw with cold and streaked with frozen tears, her gloveless hands blue and trembling, cradling a child no older than 6. The boy's face was a horrifying shade of blue-gray lips, parted in almost invisible wisp of condensation, struggling to form, then failing in the frigid air. He was terrifyingly still. She looked up, her eyes wide, wild pupils dilated with terror. Soaked lashes were freezing into tiny, cruel icicles. "Please." She choked, her voice a ragged thread nearly lost. He's not breathing. My God, I don't know what to do. He just stopped." Garrett didn't hesitate. Old training, CPR, wilderness first aid, fire rescue drills from a life he barely recognized. A life before Rachel's laughter had been stolen by black ice, surged through him like a jolt of high-voltage electricity. He dropped to his knees, snow instantly soaking through his jeans, brushing it from the child's face. Ice cold. Pulse if there was a ghost under his frozen fingertips. Severe hypothermic shock. He barked the words, a cloud of steam snatched by the wind. And respiratory arrest. How long? I don't know. Minutes 15-20 since he got really bad. He was struggling to breathe in the car, coughing so hard. Then he just collapsed. Her voice cracked, shattered into 1,000 pieces of despair. We need to get him out of this wind. My truck's dead, but it's shelter. Garrett commanded, his voice a steel whip against the storm's relentless howl. She stared, uncomprehending, lost in her terror. Now, he has a chance if we move. We use my truck for immediate shelter, then head for my cabin. It's closer than anything else equipped. Scrambling, she followed as Garrett, with practiced gentleness, scooped the boy into his arms. The child was terrifyingly light, small bones wrapped in a jacket that offered pitiful defense against the lethal cold. A raw, familiar ache clawed at Garrett's chest. An echo of a different loss, a different consuming helplessness, the night Rachel. He shook his head, focusing. He bundled the boy into his own truck's cab. Though the interior was rapidly cooling, it was still marginally better than the direct assault of the blizzard. He wrestled his emergency thermal blanket from under the seat, wrapping the child tightly. My cabin. He gritted out, already planning. It's 3 miles. Tough trek, but it's our only shot. He scanned the woman. Your name, Elena. His name is Micah. Her voice was barely a whisper. Garrett. Elena, we need to get to my cabin. It's built for this. We'll take turns carrying him. Are you strong enough to walk in this? She nodded numbly. Yes. Anything. He rummaged in his emergency kit, pulling out spare wool socks, heavy gloves, and a thermal hat for her. Put these on. Now. He then produced a small, well-worn object from his pocket. A compass. Not just any compass, but one Rachel had given him, its brass casing engraved with "Find your way home." It was his talisman. The journey was brutal. The wind shrieked, visibility dropped to near zero at times, and the snow piled higher, making each step a torturous effort. They huddled together, Garrett often shielding Elena and Micah with his larger frame, taking turns breaking trail. Twice, Elena stumbled, nearly overcome, and Garrett hauled her up, his own strength flagging. He carried Micah most of the way, the boy's inert weight, a terrifying reminder of what they were fighting. He kept talking to Elena, to Micah, a stream of encouragement, instructions, anything to pierce the storm's oppressive roar and their own creeping despair. He found himself drawing on reserves he thought long dead, a ferocity born of past failure and a desperate, burgeoning hope. He remembered Rachel, her unshakable belief in him, in the good he could do. That memory, painful as it was, became fuel. Finally, through the blinding snow, a darker shape emerged, the cabin. His sanctuary. His prison. Inside, Garrett moved with the focused intensity of a seasoned rescuer. Micah was on the worn leather couch near the massive stone fireplace, which roared to life with a single, expertly struck, long match against the hearth. The cabin was rough-hewn, built by his grandfather, filled with the scent of pine wood smoke and something older, a lingering sorrow, Rachel's cherished books still on the shelves. Snow melted in a pot on the old wood stove. Elena huddled beside her son, a statue of fear and exhaustion, her borrowed clothes already soaked through. He found dry clothes for her too, Rachel's softest wool sweater among them. He returned with towels warmed by the fire, pressing them to Micah's chest, groin, neck, and armpits, working to re-warm his core. He needs to breathe. Elena whispered, her voice raw, desperate. Garrett was already creating a makeshift steam tent with a heavy blanket draped over 2 chairs, coaxing warm, moist air from a kettle on the stove towards Micah's face. Come on, kid. He muttered, his voice rough with a prayer he hadn't known he still possessed. Fight for it. Breathe, damn you, breathe. Minutes stretched into an agonizing eternity, punctuated only by the fire's voracious crackle, the storm's relentless percussive assault on the log walls, and Elena's barely audible choked sobs. Then a flicker. A cough weak as a moth's wing against a hurricane. Elena gasped, her hand flying to her mouth. Did you hear that? Garrett nodded, jaw tight, never taking his eyes off the boy. He's fighting. More steam, more encouragement. Then a deeper breath. A stuttering inhale. Another. Micah's eyelids fluttered. He looked dazed, confused at Elena. A strangled cry tore from her. She collapsed beside him, not with weakness, but with the overwhelming force of relief, cradling his face, his chest, as if to meld her life force into his fragile form. Oh, thank God. Thank God, Micah. My baby. Garrett rose slowly, his body a symphony of protesting aches. He retreated to a shadowed corner, leaning heavily against the rough-hewn logs, and expelled a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding. It felt like he'd been holding it for years, since the night the world went silent and cold. Elena looked at him, then her face awash with tears, a stark contrast to the frozen mask he'd first encountered. You saved him." Garrett shook his head, a familiar hollowness echoing inside. "I got him warm, helped him get air. He did the rest. He's a fighter." She stood, her legs unsteady, and walked over to him. She did something that startled them both. She took his calloused, snow-chilled hand between her two, her own still bearing the angry red marks of frost nip. "Thank you," she said, her voice thick with unshed tears and profound gratitude. "You didn't have to stop. You didn't even know us." He looked at their joined hands, then at the boy on the couch, now breathing with a fragile but growing regularity, a flush of pink slowly returning to his cheeks. He hadn't saved a life like this, hadn't felt this potent mix of terror and triumph since the night he couldn't save his life, Rachel's. He swallowed the grief, a familiar stone in his throat, yet tonight it felt different, less like a solitary burden. Stay the night. Storm's not letting up. It'll be days before anyone can get through. She nodded, her gaze holding his, an unspoken understanding passing between them. He turned to the fire, adding another log, his mind a maelstrom mirroring the one outside. But amidst the turmoil, an unsettling warmth began to stir in the most frozen, desolate recesses of his soul. Tonight, something had irrevocably shifted. He felt the weight of Rachel's compass in his pocket, its silent reassurance a warmth against his thigh. Elena awoke to a silence so profound, it was jarring, a stark, blessed contrast to the blizzard's prior demonic fury. The scent of pine smoke and the faint, comforting crackle of dying embers hung in the air. Micah slept soundly beside her on a makeshift bed Garrett had arranged near the fire, his cheeks flushed a healthy pink, not that terrifying deathly blue. He was alive. The relief was a physical blow, stealing her breath as surely as the storm had. She found Garrett at the sturdy handcrafted kitchen table, a mug of coffee steaming in his scarred hand, a worn leather-bound sketchbook open before him. He looked up as she entered, his gaze direct, less haunted than the night before, but still unreadable. Coffee's hot, stove's still going. The cabin in the pale morning light was rough, yet possessed a deep, intrinsic beauty. Every timber seemed to tell a story. It was filled with the scent of wood smoke, old books, and something else. Sorrow, perhaps, but also a resilient strength. She poured herself a mug, the warmth seeping into her chilled fingers. "Your cabin? It's beautiful, in a rugged, slightly haunted, yet wonderfully comforting way." A ghost of a smile, the first she'd seen, touched his lips. Haunted's not far off. He gently closed the sketchbook. "This was Rachel's, my wife. She drew Everything. The light on the snow, the way the chickadees flitted. Said it helped her see. He then gestured to a small framed photograph on the mantelpiece. A woman with a smile that could melt glaciers, her arm around a younger, brighter-eyed Garrett and a laughing little girl with pigtails. Rachel and Sophie. Lost Rachel 3 winters back. Black ice. She was bringing home a ridiculously oversized Christmas tree. Said we needed more cheer that year. I'm so sorry. Elena said the words, feeling utterly inadequate. Used to think I could fix anything. He said, his voice flat, devoid of self-pity, just a statement of fact. Mechanic by trade, rescue volunteer on the side. Good with my hands. Couldn't fix that. Couldn't fix her. He looked at her, then his gaze searching. And you? What brings a woman and a clearly very sick child out alone into the teeth of a Montana blizzard of this magnitude? Elena stared into her mug, the dark liquid mirroring the turmoil inside her. A mistake. A desperate hope. Running. Running from a city, a life that felt like it was choking me. After the divorce. Micah's asthma, it gets worse with stress, with pollution. He needed fresh air, I told myself. I needed silence, a place to think, to disappear. I guess I just picked the wrong silence, the wrong storm. You found it, Garrett said, his voice quiet. This place is full of silence. Sometimes the good kind, sometimes not. Thank you, Garrett, for everything. You truly didn't have to. He shrugged, uncomfortable with her direct gratitude. Boy needed to breathe. Daughter needs her meds. That's all it was. But it wasn't, and they both knew it. He saw not just a panicked woman, but one with deep shadows in her eyes, hands that trembled even now as she clutched her mug. Stay till the storm fully passes, and the roads are even remotely clear. Could be days, longer. Sophie will be thrilled to have another kid around when she finally wakes. As if on cue, a sleepy voice called, Daddy. Sophie emerged, rubbing her eyes, her gaze immediately drawn to Micah, then to Elena, with a child's open curiosity. When Garrett went out later to check for damage and attempt to clear a path to the woodpile, a blast of frigid crystalline air swirled into the cabin. Elena shivered, not just from the cold, but from an unbidden premonition, and the storm she'd fled in the city, the one involving Marcus, might not be the only one she'd have to weather. This mountain, this man, they offered a precarious sanctuary. But for how long? The storm raged for 3 full days, cocooning them in an enforced intimacy. Inside, a fragile truce with the world, and perhaps with their own ghosts, began to bloom. Micah, recovering with a child's astonishing resilience, soon regarded Sophie, a pint-sized, fiercely independent whirlwind of energy, as his new best friend. They whispered secrets, built improbable forts from blankets and chairs, and their combined laughter began to chip away at the cabin's pervasive sorrow. Elena found herself watching Garrett not just with a gratitude that was a permanent ache in her chest, but with a cautious, burgeoning curiosity. He was rough-hewn, his emotions guarded as a miser's gold, but there was an undeniable solidity to him, a bedrock strength. She saw the way he always ensured Sophie ate first, the gentle way he explained the workings of a snowshoe to Micah, the nightly perimeter checks he made around the cabin. A habit she guessed from a lifetime of living with the wild at his doorstep. The faded photo of Rachel remained on the mantel, but he also kept her sketchbook close, often tracing her drawings with a calloused finger when he thought no one was looking. His grief wasn't bitter. It was a wound carried with a strange, quiet dignity, a constant companion, rather than a consuming fire. One afternoon, while Garrett was outside attempting to rig a temporary fix for his truck's fuel line, and Sophie was animatedly teaching Micah how to identify the surprisingly resilient bird calls echoing in the momentary lulls of the storm, Elena retrieved a small linen-wrapped parcel from her hastily packed bag. It contained a simple hand-stitched handkerchief, a relic from countless long nights spent in sterile hospital waiting rooms during Micah's earlier terrifying bouts of severe asthma. In one corner, in thread the color of a spring sky, she'd meticulously embroidered a single hopeful line: "May your heart never go cold again." She'd made it for herself a talisman against despair. Now it felt like it belonged to someone else. Before she lost her nerve, she quietly tucked it into the handle of the cabin door, a silent offering, a whisper of gratitude. Garrett found it the next morning when he went to fetch firewood. The careful, precise stitches, the unexpected, deeply personal sentiment. It dislodged something in him, a shard of ice that had been lodged near his heart for too long. He held it, the delicate fabric, a stark contrast to his calloused hands. The words, a quiet echo of a forgotten warmth. Later, as they shared a sparse breakfast of reconstituted oatmeal and strong coffee, he placed it by her coffee mug. "I found this, on the door." She met his gaze, a faint blush rising on her cheeks. "You saved my son's life. Words, they don't seem enough. I wanted to give something back." A long pause filled only by the hiss of the fire and the distant moan of the wind. "You already did," he said, his voice gruff, yet laden with unspoken meaning. He'd seen the life drain from his wife. He'd seen it flood back into this child. The balance felt profound. That night, a small, almost magical event occurred. Sophie, after listening to Garrett read an old worn copy of The Velveteen Rabbit to both her and Micah, crept to where Micah slept on his cot. She gently tucked the small, half-finished wooden bird Garrett had been carving, the one Elena had seen him whittling by the firelight, its lines smooth and graceful, under Micah's pillow. When Elena found it later checking on Micah before she retreated to the loft, Garrett had insisted she take a warmth spread through her, something unexpected, something akin to belonging. These small acts of kindness, of shared humanity, were weaving an invisible web around them. One week slowly melted into the next. The plows hadn't even attempted to reach the higher elevations. No one spoke of leaving the unstated reality being there was nowhere safe to go yet. A rhythm established itself. Garrett and Elena, wordlessly dividing chores, shared meals that slowly became less Spartan as Garrett unearthed forgotten caches from his winter stores stories by the fire. Sophie and Micah were inseparable, their games growing more elaborate. Elena noticed Garrett's eyes linger on her, sometimes a flicker of something unreadable, curiosity, confusion, before his guard would slam back down. She too found her gaze drawn to him, to the quiet competence of his hands, the way sadness and strength warred in his deep-set eyes. One Friday evening, inspired by a half-forgotten childhood memory, Garrett had briefly, almost unconsciously mentioned about his own mother. Elena decided on a surprise. She found a dusty jar of popcorn kernels in the back of a cupboard and a heavy cast-iron pot. Not microwaved, but real popcorn made the old-fashioned way on the wood stove, with a precious sprinkle of caramel sugar she'd hoarded in her bag for Micah, the cabin filled with a nostalgic, comforting aroma. She wrapped the warm, sweet-smelling bounty in a salvaged piece of newspaper, tied it with a length of twine from Garrett's workbench, and braving the still bitter wind, left it on the porch by his wood-splitting axe. Garrett found it when he came in from a final check of the perimeter. The aroma hit him first, a direct visceral line to his boyhood. Friday night popcorn, his mother's unwavering ritual, a beacon of normalcy in a childhood that had sometimes been anything but. He brought it inside, his expression unreadable, his gaze fixed on the makeshift parcel. "You made this?" Elena nodded, suddenly shy. "You mentioned your mom used to, on Fridays. I thought, well, it's Friday. It deserved something familiar." He didn't reply with words immediately. Instead, he walked to an old dented shortwave radio on a high shelf, a relic of his grandfather's. He twisted the dial through crackling static. until miraculously a faint but clear signal emerged. John Denver's voice, plaintive and sweet singing, "Country Roads." The improbable sound filled the small cabin. "We used to tell stories," Garrett said then, his voice raspier than usual. "Tall tales. Silliest ending won a bigger scoop of popcorn." Micah grinned, already sensing a game. Laughter, incredible, almost forgotten stories, and popcorn crumbs soon filled the small, warm space, chasing away the last of the storm's shadows. Rachel's sketchbook lay open on the table, as if she too were listening. Later, after the children were asleep by the slowly dying fire, Elena said softly, "I didn't mean to pry about the popcorn, your mother." He turned from staring into the embers, the firelight catching the silver at his temples. "When I was a kid, my dad, he wasn't always easy. Friday night popcorn, that sound, that smell. It meant everything was okay, no matter how bad the week had been. It meant peace." He looked at her, then his eyes softer, more vulnerable than she'd ever seen them. "Tonight." He paused, searching for words. "Tonight felt like something I didn't know I'd forgotten how to miss. Like breathing again after holding my breath for a long, long time." When the thaw finally began, a slow, hesitant softening of the iron-hard landscape, Garrett suggested they fix the old wooden bench Rachel had loved, the one nestled under the massive sentinel pine at the edge of the clearing. It had been damaged by a falling limb in an earlier storm, one of its legs broken, its seat weathered. As they worked together, sanding splintered wood, fitting new supports hewn from a fallen aspen, a comfortable, easy camaraderie settled between them. Sophie and Micah helped by collecting smooth stones to place around its base. "You're not bad at this," Garrett muttered, feigning surprise as Elena expertly aligned a tricky brace, holding it steady while he drilled. "Helped my grandpa in his workshop summers," she said, a faint smile playing on her lips. "Knew how to use a chisel and a plane before I could properly drive a car." He chuckled, a low rumbling sound that warmed her. "Still don't strike me as the woodshop type. City lawyer, I'd have guessed. And you don't strike me as the brooding, poetic, wounded rescuer type who can also quote Burns and fix a diesel engine." She teased back, rewarded by another glimpse of that rare smile. As the sun dipped, painting the snow-capped peaks in hues of rose and apricot, they finished. The bench stood sturdy and renewed. "She'll hold," Garrett said, stepping back, wiping sawdust from his brow. He often referred to comforting, reliable things as she. His truck, the old stove, this bench. Any place people can sit and feel safe, truly safe, is a she. Elena raised an eyebrow, a teasing light in her eyes. "That might be the most romantic, slightly animistic thing I've heard you say, Garrett Cole." His expression shifted, the teasing vanishing, replaced by a raw vulnerability that caught her off guard. Rachel was sitting right here on this very spot the day we found out about Sophie's lungs, how delicate they were. She said this bench, this view, was the only place that helped her breathe when the world got too loud, too frightening. He paused, his gaze distant, lost in memory. "This whole place, sometimes it feels like I'm just holding on to time. Like if I let go even for a second, she'll disappear completely. The memory of her." He looked down at his hands, then back at Elena, his voice raw with unshed grief. "She already disappeared. For a long time, I just didn't know where to put all the love that was left." Elena's breath caught. Without thinking, she reached out her hand, gently covering his much larger, calloused one, where it rested on the newly sanded wood. "You put it in, Sophie," she said softly. "You put it in this bench. You put it into helping people, even strangers, in a storm. It's still there, Garrett. It never left." He didn't pull away. His fingers curled slightly, a silent acknowledgement of her touch. That night, long after the children were asleep, they sat on the rebuilt bench, sharing a pot of tea brewed with mint from Rachel's neglected herb garden, a comfortable silence stretching between them, the vast, star-dusted sky arching above. The distance between grief and grace, between loneliness and a fragile nascent hope, seemed to be shrinking with every shared breath, with every beat of their healing hearts. A few days later, during a surprising burst of mild weather, Sophie, rummaging with Micah in an old cedar chest in the loft, a place filled with forgotten treasures and the lingering scent of lavender, and time pulled out a dusty metal box of photographs. "Daddy doesn't open this much," she whispered to Micah with childlike solemnity, then with an excited gasp held up a faded photograph for Elena, who was sorting through some of Rachel's knitting supplies, wondering if she could repurpose the yarn. From his rescue team days, he looked so young. Elena took the offered photograph. 7 figures in heavy winter gear snowshoes strapped to their packs stood grinning tiredly at the camera icicles on their beards and hats. Garrett was among them, younger, leaner, a confident half-smile on his face, his eyes bright with purpose. And on the back, scrawled in faded blue ink, a date and a location: Pine River Canyon, Search and Rescue. Feb 12, 2006. Successful extraction. Girl 12, hypothermic, but stable. Elena's blood turned to ice water, her breath hitching violently in her throat. That date, that place. She was 12. A family winter vacation at a rustic lodge near Pine River. Wandering too far from the marked trails, enchanted by a snowshoe hare. The sickening sharp crack of ice over a hidden current, the bone-chilling black plunge, the suffocating darkness, the desperate fight, and then a voice strong, calm, authoritative. Strong arms smelling of pine and damp wool pulling her out, wrapping her in something warm. She'd never clearly seen her rescuer's face, only heard his reassuring words, a name briefly mentioned in a local newspaper report her parents had shown her later: Garrett Cole. Garrett Cole, the man who had just saved her son, had saved her nearly 20 years ago. When Garrett returned from checking a snare line he'd set for rabbits, his cheeks flushed from the cold, she was waiting the photograph held in trembling hands. She placed it on the table before him. Sophie found this in the cedar chest. His body stiffened instantly. He picked it up, his gaze lingering on the image, then flipping it to read the inscription. A muscle worked in his jaw. "Yeah, long time ago. We pulled a kid out that day, stupidly wandered off." I recognized it. Elena whispered, her voice barely audible. "Garrett, I was the kid. The 12-year-old girl you pulled from the Pine River." Silence descended heavy and profound, broken only by the crackle of the fire. Garrett stared at her, his face paling, the implications washing over him in successive waves. He ran a hand distractedly through his already tousled hair. "I remember," he said slowly, his voice hoarse. "Small, half-conscious. Kept whispering your mom's name. Anna. You were calling for Anna." He looked at Rachel's sketchbook still on the table. "Rachel? She was a trainee with us that winter. Newer to the area. She wasn't on that specific call-out, but she knew the family you were staying with. She'd met your mother, Anna, briefly at a local craft fair the summer before. Talked about her little girl who loved to explore. Rachel had worried about you even before you went missing. Said she had a bad feeling about those thin ice patches that year." He swallowed hard. "After the rescue, she prayed for you every night for a week. Asked me if I thought you'd be okay. I told her kids were resilient." His gaze met Elena's, filled with a dawning, staggering comprehension. "Never thought I'd see you again. Let alone..." "Garrett," she whispered, tears finally tracing hot paths down her chilled cheeks. "You didn't just save Micah. You saved me. Twice. 2 decades apart. He stared at her, this woman who had appeared out of a blizzard, a ghost from his past and impossibly his present. Maybe that's why I stopped on the pass. He murmured more to himself than to her. When I saw your car, saw you kneeling in the snow. Some part of me, some forgotten instinct, some echo of Rachel's concern. It must have known. He didn't know what to do with this revelation, this profound, almost mythical tangled connection that bound their lives together through tragedy and salvation. But Elena strangely did. You don't have to do anything, Garrett, she said gently, reaching across the table to tentatively touch his hand. I just needed you to know how much you've given me, how much you've given us. The visit from Garrett's estranged father, Silas, a few days later, was another unexpected tremor, another crack in the ice that had long encased Garrett's heart. Silas arrived unannounced, his old truck rattling up the partially cleared track, looking older and more weather-beaten than Garrett remembered. The initial encounter was awkward, filled with stilted phrases and years of unspoken resentment. But Elena, with her quiet, unassuming presence, her innate empathy, somehow bridged the chasm. She made coffee, offered Silas some of Sophie's freshly baked, if slightly lopsided cookies, and her gentle questions about his journey, about the old days on the mountain, slowly coaxed him out of his shell. With Elena there as a buffer, a catalyst, Garrett found words he thought long buried. Words of anger, yes, but also words of pain, of longing for a connection he'd thought severed forever. And Silas, to Garrett's surprise, listened. By the end of the afternoon, as the winter sun cast long shadows, a fragile, tentative bridge towards understanding, perhaps even forgiveness, had been spanned. He can come next Friday for popcorn, Sophie declared decisively later that evening, inadvertently sealing the tentative peace with a child's simple wisdom. If he brings stories. Garrett found himself actually looking forward to it. As the days shortened towards the solstice, a local tradition Garrett had almost forgotten began to stir in the small, scattered community down the mountain, and the Winter Light Lantern Festival. Rachel had adored it. People crafted simple paper lanterns, and on the darkest afternoon of the year would walk a cleared path in the woods, hanging their lanterns to light the way, symbolizing hope and the returning sun. Elena, hearing Sophie excitedly chatter about memories of it from before Rachel passed, seized upon the idea. Together with Micah's enthusiastic, if clumsy assistance, they transformed the cabin. Using scavenged paper-dried berries for color and salvaged string, they created a dozen beautiful, if rustic, paper lanterns. Christmas Eve arrived with a soft, hushed snowfall, each flake a tiny messenger of peace. Garrett, returning from a final check on his traps, stood stunned in the doorway. The cabin, usually so Spartan, glowed. Paper lanterns, interspersed with fragrant pine boughs Sophie had gathered, hung from the rafters, casting a warm, magical light. Elena and the children, their faces alight with pride, were just finishing. He found himself helping light the last one, his fingers brushing Elena's, as they adjusted the small candle within. A spark, gentle but undeniable, ignited between them. Dinner was a feast of roasted grouse. Garrett had managed to procure wild rice, and Elena's surprisingly delicious dried apple pie. Laughter and stories flowed as easily as the mulled cider. Afterward, Garrett, moved by an impulse he didn't question, pulled out a box of Rachel's favorite Christmas vinyl records, and after a few false starts, got the old turntable spinning. As Judy Garland's voice filled the cabin with, "Have yourself a merry little Christmas," he saw Rachel and Sophie's joyous laugh, in the way Micah's eyes sparkled. He felt her presence not as a painful void, but as part of the warmth, the rediscovered life Elena and Micah had impossibly brought back into his frozen world. Later, Elena shyly presented him with a small, hand-bound manuscript. The cover, made from pressed birch bark, was lettered in careful ink, "The Man in the Snow, A Story of Hope" by Elena Harper. Inside, he found their story, his story, written with a grace and insight that humbled him. No one's ever written about me." He choked out his throat tight. "Then it's long past time." She smiled, her eyes luminous in the lantern light. Later, still standing by the window, watching the gentle snowfall under the ethereal glow of their handmade lanterns, he whispered, his voice thick with emotion, I wish this doesn't have to end. This feeling, this peace." Elena leaned her head on his shoulder, a comfortable, trusting weight. "Maybe," she whispered back, her breath warm against his neck. "Maybe it doesn't." The morning after Christmas, they walked to the repaired bench, and there benched the snow crunching softly under their boots. The air was crisp, clean, pregnant with unspoken possibilities. "Do you believe in fate, Elena?" Garrett asked, his gaze sweeping over the snow-draped peaks, majestic and serene in the morning light. "Or maybe second chances. I thought I'd used up all the good in me a long time ago. That love, real love, was a door that had closed forever. Then you came back. Twice. It felt like, I don't know, forgiveness. Like Rachel somehow sent you." Elena looked at Rachel's sketchbook, which she now carried with her, sometimes a tangible link to the woman whose spirit seemed to infuse the very logs of the cabin. She'd found a pressed columbine, Rachel's favorite wildflower, tucked between pages, detailing the summer light, and a faint pencil sketch of a girl by a river, a girl with Elena's unruly childhood curls. "I thought I didn't need anyone," she confessed, her voice trembling slightly, not from cold, but from the magnitude of her emotions. "I thought strength meant standing alone. But you, Garrett, Sophie, you've shown me I don't have to do it all alone. That sometimes real strength is in letting someone in. Say it," he whispered, turning to face her, his eyes pleading. "What you feel, Elena. Please. It wasn't just you I found in that storm, Garrett." She smiled through a fresh wave of tears, her heart overflowing. "I found myself again, too. I found hope." And he kissed her then, under the silent watch of the ancient pine, a kiss of profound grief acknowledged, and gratitude deeply felt, a kiss of shared memory, and the promise of a shared homecoming. The peace, however, the fragile, precious peace they had so carefully nurtured, was about to be shattered. 2 days later, as a watery winter sun tried to assert its authority over the landscape, a sleek, dark, aggressively modern SUV, utterly out of place in the rustic wilderness, crunched its way up the barely cleared track to the cabin. A man emerged, city sharp, in an expensive tailored coat, his dark hair perfectly slicked back, an arrogant, predatory smirk playing on his lips that sent an immediate chill down Elena's spine. A chill that had nothing to do with the mountain air, and everything to do with a past she thought she'd outrun. "Marcus, us," she breathed, her blood running cold as glacial meltwater. Micah, who had been happily showing Sophie a bird's nest he'd found near the woodpile, shrank back at the tone of his mother's voice, his small face clouding with fear. Garrett, splitting firewood nearby with practiced rhythmic swings of his axe, saw the abrupt tension in Elena's stance, the way the newfound color instantly leached from her face, replaced by a stark, familiar terror. He set down his axe, every protective instinct he possessed screaming danger, his body tensing like a wolf sensing a rival. "Elena, darling." Marcus set his voice a silken, cultured purr that was somehow more menacing than a shout. "Quite the rustic hideaway you found. A bit primitive for your refined tastes, wouldn't you say?" He ignored Garrett completely, his cold, assessing eyes fixed on Elena, dissecting her. "Took some doing to find you, I'll admit. But you always were rather predictable when you were scared, my dear. Always running for the quiet places. What do you want, Marcus? Elena's voice, though low, was steadier than she felt. Sophie, sensing the sudden dangerous shift in the atmosphere, had instinctively slipped behind Garrett, her small hand clutching the rough denim of his jeans. What I'm owed, of course, Marcus replied, his smile widening, though it never reached his chillingly empty eyes. You made certain promises, Elena, and then you and my son conveniently disappeared. That wasn't part of our arrangement, was it? He took a proprietary step towards her. Thought a little trip up to this charmingly desolate mountain might persuade you to be more cooperative. Garrett stepped forward, then deliberately placing himself between Marcus and Elena, a silent, unmovable barrier. She doesn't want to talk to you. You need to leave. Now. Marcus finally acknowledged Garrett's presence, a flicker of dismissive contempt in his gaze. And who might you be, the local lumberjack providing fireside companionship? Stay out of this, pal. This is a private matter between me and my estranged wife. She's not your wife anymore, Marcus. Elena cut in her voice, gaining strength from Garrett's steadfast presence. The divorce was finalized months ago, and I'm not going back with you. Not ever. Oh, I think you will. Marcus sneered, his polished veneer cracking to reveal the ugliness beneath. You see, there are people, influential people, who are very unhappy that you decided to develop a conscience just when things were getting interesting. That rather comprehensive little dossier you so diligently compiled, it's caused quite a stir. They'd pay quite handsomely for its return, and naturally for your silence. He took another step closer, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial, threatening whisper. Or perhaps, if financial incentives don't move you, your son's future well-being might be a more persuasive argument. Micah whimpered a small, terrified sound and tried to burrow deeper behind Elena. Elena flinched as if struck, her hand instinctively going to her son. Rage, cold and lethal, as a mountain viper coiled tight in Garrett's gut. He'd faced down charging moose and cornered bears with less malice than he felt towards this man. You threaten her child again. Garrett set his voice a low, dangerous growl. And this conversation, and possibly your ability to have any others, ends very, very differently. Suddenly, a low guttural rumble echoed from the higher peaks, a sound Garrett knew with chilling intimacy. The heavy snowpack on the upper slopes, unstable from the recent freeze-thaw cycles, and the new fall was letting go. Avalanche. He hissed, his eyes darting towards the south face of the mountain. It's a big one inside now. Marcus looked unnerved for a fleeting moment, glancing towards the peaks, then scoffed. Don't be so overly dramatic, lumberjack. A bit of snow. The roar intensified, transforming from a distant rumble into a monstrous, unstoppable freight train of snow ice and debris. Garrett didn't wait. He grabbed Elena's arm, shoving her towards the cabin, yelling, Sophie, Micah, get away from the windows, get to the back wall. Marcus, caught between his city-bred arrogance and a dawning primal fear, hesitated a fatal half-second too long. A colossal wall of white surged down the near slope, not a direct, catastrophic hit on the cabin itself, which was somewhat protected by a thick stand of old-growth pine and a rocky outcrop, but close enough. It obliterated the track, shook the cabin to its very foundations, and sent a terrifying, suffocating plume of snow dust and ice particles high into the air, engulfing everything in a temporary choking whiteout. Marcus's expensive SUV, parked too close to the incline of the now vanished track, was instantly, violently, and completely buried under tons of snow. When the shaking finally stopped and the air began to clear, an eerie, profound silence descended, broken only by the children's frightened sobs from within the cabin. They were trapped. Completely. Marcus, now deathly pale and visibly shaken, stood amidst a newly formed drift that had nearly engulfed him, his arrogant smirk replaced by a mask of disbelief and raw fear. "Well," Garrett said, his voice flat, devoid of any triumph. "Looks like you're not going anywhere for a while." He saw Sophie peek out from behind him, her eyes wide, but assessing. "Soph," he said calmly, "remember that old ham radio in the attic? The one with the emergency beacon Grandpa installed?" Sophie's eyes widened further this time in understanding, and she nodded quickly, slipping back into the relative safety of the cabin. "You think this changes anything?" Marcus spat, attempting to regain some semblance of his composure, though his voice trembled and his gaze kept darting to the mountainside, now a chaotic jumble of snow and uprooted trees. "I'll still get what I came for. She's coming with me." He lunged towards Elena, a desperate, wild look in his eyes. Garrett intercepted him with a solid, well-aimed block. They grappled a desperate, clumsy fight in the deep, fresh snow, the cold air burning in their lungs. Marcus, though sleeker, was surprisingly strong, fueled by a potent combination of desperation and entitlement. He landed a glancing punch to Garrett's jaw that sent stars exploding behind Garrett's eyes. But Garrett, grounded in this land, powered by years of physical labor and a fiercely protective fury he hadn't felt since Rachel was threatened by anything, fought back with the primal strength of a man defending his home, his last stand, his newfound family. Elena screamed as Marcus, breaking free for a moment, fumbled inside his expensive coat and pulled out a small, wicked-looking switchblade, the blade snapping open with a menacing click. Just as he raised it, lunging towards an off-balance Garrett, Micah, emboldened by a surge of desperate courage to protect the man who had saved him, threw a heavy chunk of firewood he'd been carrying for the kindling box. It flew true, hitting Marcus squarely on the wrist. The knife clattered uselessly into the snow. Garrett seized the momentary advantage, tackling Marcus hard, subduing him with a swift, practiced move that pinned him face down in the drift, just as the distant but distinct thwump, thwump, thwump of a helicopter's rotors began to cut through the unnerving silence. Sophie, clever, resourceful Sophie, had managed to navigate the snow-blocked attic hatch and activate the emergency beacon. Hours later, the immediate chaos had subsided. Marcus, sullen and spitting impotent threats, was gone, airlifted out by a National Guard helicopter, summoned by the emergency beacon, accompanied by local deputies who had been alerted to the avalanche and the subsequent signal. The road to the cabin was completely blocked by several feet of avalanche debris, and it would be days, perhaps a week, before it could be cleared. But for now, they were safe. Elena stood with Garrett on the porch, the air sharp, clean, and ringing with a profound, almost sacred stillness. He said, "A dossier." Garrett began, his gaze gentle but searching as he looked at her. "And that people were unhappy?" What did he mean, Elena? Elena took a deep, shuddering breath, the story she'd held captive for so long, finally ready to be released. "My ex-husband, Marcus, he wasn't just unfaithful, not just emotionally abusive. He was involved in some very dirty, very illegal business dealings through his corporate law firm. Fraud on a massive scale, extortion, money laundering. I was a junior lawyer there, initially blind to it all. When I finally found out, stumbled upon the evidence, I couldn't ignore it. I compiled everything meticulously. I was supposed to testify, become a witness for the prosecution." Her voice broke. "He threatened Micah. Said if I ever spoke, if I ever helped them, he'd make sure I lost my son, or worse. So I ran. I thought disappearing into anonymity was the only way to keep Micah safe." She buried her face in her hands. "I was so scared, Garrett. For so long." Garrett pulled her close, his arms a strong, steady refuge. "You don't have to be scared anymore, Elena." He murmured into her hair. "Not anymore. You're safe here. We're safe. He held her tightly, and she let the fear and the bone-deep exhaustion, the accumulated weight of years of running and hiding, finally spill out in quiet, cleansing tears against his solid chest. He just held her, offering the silent, unwavering support of a man who understood loss, understood fear, and understood finally the fierce, unbreakable power of protection. That night, by the warm glow of the fire, after a subdued but comforting meal, Sophie shyly approached Garrett. She held out something small, something she'd clearly been working on in secret with Elena. It was a small, perfectly carved wooden ring fashioned from a piece of polished pine, its grain glowing in the firelight. "Dad," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "For you. To give to Elena. Because she makes you smile again the way Mama used to. And," she added with a proud glance at Elena, "I helped Elena sand it really smooth, so it's kind of from both of us." Garrett's throat tightened, a wave of emotion threatening to overwhelm him. He knelt, his eyes suspiciously wet, taking the small, perfect ring. He looked from Sophie's earnest, hopeful face to Elena, her own face soft and luminous, in the firelight, tears shimmering in her eyes. He thought of Rachel's compass, "Find your way home," and her sketchbook filled with beauty. He had found his way. They had all found their way. Later, beneath a canopy of brilliant, indifferent stars, the snow-covered world silent and serene, around them, he took Elena's hand. "Elena Harper," he said, his voice thick with an emotion that felt like a lifetime of winters finally thawing. "I know this isn't gold or diamonds, but it's made of this place, this mountain. It's made of us, of Sophie's hope and my heart." He slid the simple pine ring onto her finger. It fit perfectly. "Will you stay? Will you take a chance with Sophie with me? Will you build this life with us?" Tears streamed freely down Elena's cheeks, now tears of joy, of relief, of a profound, bone-deep homecoming. "Yes," she whispered, her voice trembling but certain. "Oh, Garrett, yes, of course, yes." 1 year later, the cabin no longer just a refuge, but truly a home, buzzed with a life and warmth that had once seemed impossible. Snow fell softly outside, blanketing the world in pristine white. But inside, the fire roared, laughter echoed, and the scent of baking bread mingled with pine. Elena, having bravely and decisively testified against Marcus and his now incarcerated associates, had seen her book, "The Man in the Snow," celebrated not for sensationalism or bestseller lists, but for its quiet heart, its testament to resilience and unexpected grace. Garrett, rediscovering his own quiet joy in creation, now ran occasional woodworking workshops for the small mountain community, sharing his grandfather's skills, his own quiet wisdom. Sophie and Micah, inseparable as ever, were animatedly explaining the convoluted rules of a newly invented board game to a group of giggling children from the valley, children of friends they'd all made. Silas, Garrett's father, now a regular Friday night popcorn guest, watched them with a gentle, redeemed smile, his relationship with his son slowly, painstakingly healing. Garrett found Elena later standing by their bench, their special place, watching the snow fall. He slipped his arms around her from behind, resting his chin on her shoulder. "You ever think?" he asked softly, his breath warm against her ear. "How it all started, all of this? Us?" Elena leaned back against him, her hand adorned with its simple glowing wooden ring covering his where it rested on her arm. "Every single day," she admitted. "A broken-down truck in a blizzard, a child on the brink of death, a storm that felt like the end of the world." She turned in his arms, her eyes shining with a love that was as deep and steadfast as the mountain itself. And a man who stopped when he didn't have to. Not once, but twice. a man who showed me what home truly means. He kissed her then, a long, slow kiss that tasted of pine wood smoke and forever. I think, he murmured against her lips. We saved each other, Elena Harper. I think, she whispered back, her hand nestled securely in his. We still are. Love, like the toughest, most resilient mountain pine, had taken root in the unlikeliest, most frozen of ground. It had weathered the fiercest storms, endured the deepest losses, and finally, against all odds, had bloomed. Quiet, tenacious, and breathtakingly beautiful, against the pure, unforgiving snow. The cabin hadn't changed the world, not in any grand sense. But it had irrevocably changed theirs. And in the enduring warmth of its hearth, a family forged in crisis, tempered by kindness, and bound by a love as wild and true as the Montana wilderness had finally truly found its forever.